Good morning, y'all. Thanks for getting up so early. This is real early Los Angeles time, just so you know. And we're so glad you're here. So I have the distinct pleasure of introducing a couple of folks who are going to have what I know will be a really inspiring and enlightening conversation. In a bit, you'll hear from Christopher Hawthorne. You can read Christopher's amazing biography. He was a longtime architecture critic for the LA Times. We share a deep love of the East Bay in the Bay Area and roots there. But Christopher always took a broader view and has convened a conversation about the third LA, about an LA that is about places that are for people, that is about re-envisioning the bones of our city. And the mayor, in his wisdom, said, "Oh, that's nice that you're saying all of that from outside City Hall. Why don't you come over here and do that inside City Hall?" And he has the distinct honor of serving as the city's first chief design officer. So he has turned state's evidence in the best possible way. And I'm very, very lucky to get to work with him on some big things that are coming to Los Angeles. But right now I'm going to introduce my boss, Mayor Eric Garcetti. I could tell you some great things about my boss. I could tell you how he has made it his business to make sure there are no longer any all-male commissions in the city of Los Angeles. Yes, amen. Over half of the commissioners that do the city's business are women now. We look like the city that we are and that we serve, and we are really better for it. I could tell you about how he fought to raise the wage. I could tell you about how he fought to get out the vote. But right now I'm going to tell you another story. So when I first got this job, I had my first one-on-one with my first boss. I was in the middle of a sustained, but I think well-suppressed panic attack for the first few months of the job. Well, let's be honest, it was the first year. And I went into this meeting and we're talking about big things. We're talking about transportation. We're talking about streets. We're talking about Los Angeles. And at the time, an amusement park celebrating a certain boy wizard was getting ready to open over at NBC Universal Studios. And the mayor, because he's amazing, just happened to have a stash supply of wands. And he gave me one. This is Neville Longbottom's wand. I have carried it in my purse every single day of this job. You have no idea how often it comes in handy as a prop. When people ask me to do the things they ask me to do in this job, occasionally I'll say, you know what, I got a magic wand, why don't you try it? But, you know, that story is about finding your friends and fighting hard for what you believe in. And that's really the mission of NACTO, and that's really what we're doing under the mayor's leadership in the city of Los Angeles. This is a mayor whose first executive directive was called Great Streets. His 10th executive directive was called Vision Zero. Every single one of his budgets has had millions of dollars of investment for safety, for thriving streets, for streets as places for people. But that wasn't enough. He decided to take that fight countywide and spent hundreds of hours in coffee shops and convention centers trying to get the people of LA County to pass an evergreen 1-cent sales tax that will bring billions of dollars to the restoration of light rail in this county and be the most transformative thing that I think we'll see in our lifetimes, technology included. So with that, I just want to say that luck is really about hard work meeting opportunity, and nobody embodies that more than Mayor Eric Garcetti.
Thanks, Mayor. Good to see you.
You too. Thank you so much. Thank you, Salita, and I'm so glad you have the wand. I wish we could do like Evanesco to traffic, but we couldn't quite get rid of that. A couple people got that joke. But thank you so much for all that you have done, Madam President. Thank you for this convening that is here. Welcome to Los Angeles, to the City of Angels, to everybody who has taken time to travel across the country. It's probably quite a late breakfast for some of you on the East Coast. I always imagine one day I'll actually go to a conference in Hawaii so that when I wake up at 8 a.m. it'll be 11 or whatever. So welcome here. We are so glad to have you here, and so glad to have you here in this place at this moment. So let me orient you really quickly. I am not facing due east. That is not due north, south, and west. We're actually off at a 45-degree angle. And we're a strange coastal town because we are a coastal town whose downtown isn't on the coast. One of the only coastal cities in the world where the main buildings aren't abutting where the first settlement was on the coast. And that's because of the Los Angeles River. Los Angeles River runs a couple miles to the east of here. And in this land where for 10,000 years native Tongva lived, there was an expedition in 1769 of the first kind of travelers from outside here to come, a group of Franciscans who came along the Los Angeles River. It was the day of St. Francis when they took camp a little bit to the north of here, where another river that comes from Pasadena called the Arroyo Seco meets the intersection of what's now the Los Angeles River. And it was such a verdant place that it reminded them of the Porciuncula, which is the small church that St. Francis built for himself in Assisi. And as Franciscans, they took communion in the river and then christened the river El Río de Nuestra Señora la Reina de los Ángeles de Porciuncula, which luckily we've shortened to LA. It's a little bit more convenient. But they wrote about 2 earthquakes that visited them that day in the journal of Father Juan Crespi. I hope no earthquakes visit you while you're here. And how one day a great mission would be built here. And it's funny because San Francisco is also named after St. Francis. I just met the mayor of Assisi at the climate summit in San Francisco a couple weeks ago, and she was running around. She's like, I have to get a picture with the mayor of San Francisco and the mayor of Los Angeles because you're both named after something to do with Assisi. And what's interesting about LA is there was never a mission built here. The missionizing of California, for better or for worse, there was never a mission built, even though they planned one. And instead, it was the first pueblo, or first town built in Southern California, some 12 years later, when a group of pobladores, settlers who came up here from Baja California and lower New Spain, who look like America does today, interestingly. The 44 of them traced their ancestry back to the Americas, to Africa, to Europe, and to Asia. 24 of the 44 had African blood, for instance. 2 were classified as Chino, which was actually not Chinese, they were Filipino. And we were founded the same year the Continental Congress was commissioning a study along the Potomac to see whether swampland would be a good place for our nation's capital. So we're actually, even though we were Spanish first, older even than Washington, D.C. So that's where you are. Now the reason, back to the north, south, east, west, you're at 45-degree angle, is the founding fathers and mothers of this city figured that it was better to have a 45-degree angle off the cardinal points because it was one of the first green building cities. That was better for the wind and ventilation in the hot summer, and it was better for the sun and heat in relatively cooler winters. They built with adobe, which was a sustainable material, and right now, all that you see, this great metropolis that has grown since now, has not only survived but thrived. It is the 3rd largest economy in the world of any city. Tokyo's #1, New York's #2, and we're just behind now as #3. 18 million people, the 22nd most populous megacity in the world, but 3rd in terms of economic output, so per person, the most economic output in the world. And of course, LA is this crossroads of the world, the northern capital of Latin America, western capital of the United States, eastern capital of the Pacific Rim. We'd almost have to build a city here if one didn't exist, given what's going on in the world today. But what we have now is an opportunity not just to be a great city for Southern California, but we hope for this country and for the world. So, let me start by saying much of what you think you know about LA is probably wrong. You probably know us as the car capital of the world, and in some ways we are. But that's only part of the story. We weren't actually built around the car. What's interesting is our freeways are where the old roadways and rail lines were, which is where the old Indian pathways were, which are where the water used to flow in Los Angeles. So when you are on a freeway, and we kind of joke sometimes at the traffic flow, it doesn't flow much these days, but when you do hear a flow of it, it's like the flow of water. It is the traffic along freeways where water once flowed. And it was made possible, really, the sprawl of this city by the red car, which you see right here, which at the time was the world's largest electrified inner urban railway. And don't believe Roger Rabbit, the car companies didn't buy it up and destroy it. Then people moved to the next technology, which was cutting edge at the time, freeways, which worked really well for a while until they didn't. But when I was growing up here, certainly it was 20 minutes anywhere in Los Angeles. That was a cliche, but it was kind of true. I grew up in the San Fernando Valley, part of the city that if it was an independent city would be the 6th largest city in America. It's where the Brady Bunch house is, which was recently resold, if you saw that in the news. And LA folks now drive less and take more transit than most major American cities, which folks don't recognize and realize because so many of us are still stuck, of course, in cars. But nevertheless, we earned a reputation, well-earned, as the kind of mecca of an automobile-based vision of post-war prosperity. And we did either famously or infamously become the car capital of the world. But today, we're changing that vision. We are moving towards a radically different look at what Los Angeles will be, as all cities need to do to keep up. We look at transportation not as an issue area, but as a prism through which we can refract life in Los Angeles. You want to talk about air quality? Look through transportation. You want to talk about jobs? Look through transportation. You want to understand a housing crisis and homelessness? Look at transportation. You want to look at things like gender equity? Look at transportation. You want to understand who you're going to date and marry? Look at transportation. It is a human-focused life prism through which we look at what we are doing. And this human issue that we have, the things that we grapple with in any big city, whether it's poverty or just tucking our kids in at bed at night, we have tried to humanize that. And when we passed Measure M, which I'll get to in a second, the measure that Salita mentioned, I'll tell you a quick story. We raised $10 million to do that, which was the most ever for a local political measure. And we need a 2/3 vote in California. All the Californians know to raise a tax, it's a 2/3 vote. So you might think from other parts of the country we're a liberal place, but 1/3 of people wake up against sunshine. I mean, it is very difficult to get a 2/3 vote ever. And so we raised this money, and for 2 weeks we did the typical transportation ads. You saw trains going and buses and freeways with no traffic that we got from stock footage in the 1950s. And you know, all these things, jobs like this picture that were going to come. And we went from, we were always very close, maybe 63, 64% in our early polls, which is why we went for it. But 2 weeks into spending $5 million on TV, we were down at 61%. And I had staked my political future on this, 3 years of bringing together 88 cities, really understanding that Los Angeles City, while the biggest city in the region, was not even a majority of the residents. All of this stuff, and I was like, we're going to go down. And my political consultant said, I got an idea. Why don't you get in the car, and I'll bring a camera and no script, and let's just talk. And it was Saturday, and I borrowed my wife's car, and we started driving. And the ad that made it onto TV was me saying, hey, everybody, it's like Mayor Eric Garcetti, here we are stuck in rush hour traffic. And then I turned to the camera, and I said, only problem is it's Saturday afternoon. And everybody understood that in Los Angeles. They understood what that meant, that this great thief of time and of money called traffic, that we had to think differently. And when we made it a human issue rather than just statistics and lines and miles, we won that vote. We went from 61% to over 71% in just 2 weeks. So our vision is not more vehicles. Our vision is to move people safely where they want to go, how they want to go. And you can see here a picture of Ciclavia. We just closed from downtown. I know many of you participated in it, got here early. All the way to the Hollywood Bowl, one of the largest stretches. Just to give you an idea, it's a stretch of land about 20 times longer than Central Park in New York, that we closed streets and went between downtown and the Hollywood Bowl, and 150,000 people celebrated and enjoyed. And yeah, it's a pain in the butt if you're driving, but who cares? I was driving that day, part of the day, but we know that it was a way of liberating the city, and the smiles and the health and the mobility that we were able to expand. We now have the largest closed streets celebration events in the nation. And you know, LA is in the middle of this transportation renaissance. Our key accomplishments, as mentioned, are Measure M, which is really an infinite amount of money, but we had to quantify it. So for the next 40 years, it'll be $120 billion. It was a permanent 1-cent sales tax, which is almost unheard of passing. And the longer we said it lasted, the better it did in focus groups in terms of how many people would support it. That's a strange thing in my business. You used to have to say, it's just going to be a 5-year tax or a 10-year tax. We promise then we'll give it back, blah, blah, blah. And when we asked people why, they said, transportation is like education. You don't say a temporary 5-year tax for schools, and then we'll see if people 6 years from now want to send their kids to school. You put a tax in for schools. because you know that there will always be children who should and need to go to school. I don't know if the kids feel that way, but we know that as the parents that they need to go. So when we looked at it, people said the same thing about transportation, that we needed that to happen. This is 15 new rapid transit lines, most of them light rail and subway. It's including road improvements and ways that we can improve safety, local return for every one of those 88 cities, highway improvements on our freeways as well, and really a vision of what this county will look like 40 years from now. And aggressively within that, we've done a 28 by 28. When the Olympics and Paralympics come here, an American Olympics and Paralympics that I hope you all will celebrate and be a part of, we want to have 28 of those projects accelerated and done in the next 10 years. Just 2.5 years ago, you wouldn't have been able to ride rail to the ocean. We opened that up. We are now looking at a subway that will take us from downtown to UCLA in 22 minutes, which beats traffic even at 3 a.m. You can see this boring machine. We have 4 mega projects under construction, including one just underfoot here. A Crenshaw LAX connection. We're finally getting public transportation to our airport, which causes applause here whenever I say it, and everybody else goes, "You don't have public transportation to your airport?" when they hear it from any other city. Our regional connector that will connect all the lines downtown, a Purple Line extension, as I mentioned, which is our line to UCLA on the west side, our Gold Line extension, which goes through Pasadena and out to the east part of our county. And our work that we're doing is everything from the bike share that you see here, our Vision Zero, which has been 1,200 improvements that have gone through just in the last couple years. Great streets, the idea of bracing streets and looking at how we help small businesses be part of that life so that transportation isn't just about what you do on the street, it's what you do alongside the street as well. And of course, things like My Figueroa, which Figueroa here, if you go down further south, you'll see that we just opened that about a month ago. Improvements to public transit, to mobility, to walkability, from USC all the way to where we are downtown. And of course, we're looking at equity. When we look at something like our car share, we started with electric vehicles, car share, in our poorest communities first. Not just putting it in kind of the hip areas, not just in the high-income areas, but the opposite, making sure that people who actually need cars once in a while and don't maybe have them or can't afford them can also be part of a green revolution as well. So the revolution is here. It's coming in Los Angeles. It's happening before our eyes, I think, faster than we realize. Shared mobility, autonomous vehicles, even urban aviation will be one of the first 3 cities with Dallas and Dubai to have VTOLs, vertical takeoff and landing vehicles that are electric and that can take people for a little bit more than the price of a shared car right now across town and maybe 1/10 the time that it does today. We look at challenges that come, though, at the same time, and we're trying to be a city. I'll conclude with this and bring Christopher up so we can have more of a conversation. I find so many cities are future phobic, or if they're not future phobic, they're future passive. The future phobic ones try to keep away what's happening, and you can't really keep technology away. Remember the days we were going to keep Amazon away and save the bookstore? Didn't really work out that well. And then the alternate is people say, well, you can't change the future, let's just be passive about it. Some people are really excited about it, they're evangelists about technology. Some are depressed about it, missing that bookstore or whatever is going to happen. But there's very few cities that are future guiding, that sit down with a Lyft or with others and say, let us write those rules together. We see it now with electric scooters and others. There's always somebody coming in disrupting. They say, just get out of our way. Cities often over-resist, instead of both sides figuring out a way to come together and have that conversation where we are the experts of knowing what the public needs, and you are the experts of helping bring something disruptive that can raise the quality of life. That's how we approach those challenges here in LA, of not being a city that says no, but that wants to get to yes with you. If you're willing to sit down with us, come here. And the last thing I'll say is it's my goal to make Los Angeles the transportation technology capital of the world. A place where we grow those jobs, a place where we grow that innovation, where you can test anything from the largest port in the Americas on cargo containers and trucking, where we've said we'll have the first zero-emission port in the world and what is already the greenest port in the world, all the way to looking at ways people will deliver packages in our city, whether it's terrestrial on our sidewalks or whether it's aerial using drones. This is a town ready to work on those things together, and we look forward to a network of similar entrepreneurs in the transportation space. And by entrepreneurs, I don't mean business people, I mean all of you. That's why I'm so excited to have you here, because you are those dreamers, you are those imaginers. Fix congestion now, yes, but reimagine the city tomorrow. And if we get that done, we'll look back and we'll say this car capital known as LA, next time you come here, will have been the transportation technology capital of the world. Thank you, and why don't we bring up Christopher to interview some thanks. Thanks you, NACTO. It is a real privilege to have you here. Hello, sir.
Morning, how are you?
Morning. We've done this many times before. He worked with me, so this will be interesting. You can still ask the tough questions, don't worry.
I was just going to say, it's many of these conversations that we had in my old life when I was the architecture critic at the LA Times that really convinced me that making the switch was worth it, because you've been so consistently engaged on these issues. I was really struck by your notion of transportation as a prism for understanding the city, and certainly you could argue that there has been a closer connection in Los Angeles between mobility and transportation and civic identity than any other city in the country, if not the world. Rainer Banham, the architecture critic from London, who wrote a still very significant book about Los Angeles, The Architecture of Four Ecologies, in 1971, he was not a driver when he came to America to start working on that book. He was a dedicated cyclist, and he wrote in that book famously that he learned to drive in order, as he put it, to read Los Angeles in the original, as generations of Italian, English intellectuals had learned Italian in order to read Dante in the original. So that sense that it's really only through mobility that we can understand the city. Given all of the flux that you mentioned, changes in how we get around the city, do you think that's still fundamental to our understanding of the place? How we see the city through a windshield is sort of
Snapshot today, but rapidly changing, I would say. I mean, it's interesting you said that about being so fundamental to our identity. I lived in New York, I went to school there, and your shoes are really important in New York, what shoe you wear, right? Like your sneaker, like New York sneaker culture. And it's because I think it's your main mode of transportation. It's how you look at people. So you are what you wear there, but you are what you drive in Los Angeles. So people will stretch beyond their budgets to live in a hovel, but have a nicer car, because that's kind of probably where you're spending more time awake in, but B, it becomes your image. I think less and less. I think there's so many people I have conversations with all the time who say, wow, I never have experienced LA at that scale, like people who just were at Ciclovia. Like, it was so great. Biking through a street that I drive through hundreds of times, I got to see each one of those shops and those restaurants and the park. And I think as people walk and use transit too, they're rediscovering a city that's always been there. And so the scale is still great and fun, both in the aerial sense. I mean, we're one of the few places too that actually puts architecture out for planes, adds on tops of things. The new Rams Stadium, the most expensive stadium that will ever be built in human history, is right before you land at LAX. But at the car level, the giant donuts, the things that you go by that are still at architecture, I think it'll always be part of who we are. But in the meantime, we're also like, oh, I live in a neighborhood too, and it's pretty cool.
And Ciclovia has really been transformative, one of the most significant changes to the city and how we understand it, how we move through it since I've arrived. I think the challenge now, as we've discussed, is making permanent some of the change of perspective that is enabled by an event like Ciclovia. So as we move to new forms of mobility, you talked a lot about electric scooters. I'm sure there's a lot of curiosity in this room about how you would characterize our approach from the city side to regulating dockless scooters and how you see that approach evolving over time.
I find them personally very exciting. I'm excited and a little anxious. The word that I put together is I'm kind of anxieted about them. I find I want to make sure that we work out safety, because we're starting to track through our fire department, for instance, through our paramedics, how many accidents and how traumatic they are for folks who aren't necessarily using them safely. But unlike car share, which right now isn't necessarily reducing traffic in places, it's reducing, I think, some parking spots. But car trips, in terms of the environment, it's not necessarily reducing. I think that electric scooters are. Not all of them, but I think a good percentage of electric scooter rides really are taking people out of cars, to be able to ride. And it's just so darn fun. As a fellow elected official of mine said, I look at it, they're not wearing helmets, I'm worried about their lives, but they're smiling so broadly, I don't want to take that away. Like, there's a certain thing about human beings choosing and deciding what they want. And I think that cities should figure out a way to make that safer and make it work. I think it's got great potential too for our bike infrastructure, that finally, as companies have said about sharing some of their revenues in this model, because we're on track to have electric scooter rides in about 2.5 years be as many rides as our ride share, if the trend continues. I mean, that's an astounding statistic. But if we had a revenue sharing model, we could really build out much more quickly the bike infrastructure that we want, because if we can figure out a way for people to co-share that space, electric scooters and bikes, we might have something that actually helps us reduce traffic, reduce pollution, and increase mobility.
I agree. I think the smarter bike advocates see a potential complementary relationship, a partnership there. But in a larger sense, given all of the flux that you mentioned, given how much is changing, how much uncertainty there is in the mobility realm, across the board, how do we, as we begin to make the final decisions about what that rail network looks like, and in terms of equity, as you mentioned, how do you balance in terms of where we put fixed rail lines, how we balance investment between bus and rail, how we plot these sort of fixed investments versus all of the fluidity that new technology is bringing to this world?
Well, I think in terms of equity and transportation, the most important thing, and I'll come back to bus and rail, is really housing. And housing policy is absolutely critical to everything you do, because we see it time and time again. The promise of transit can displace and can exacerbate traffic inequity as much as it can help. So what it does, I'm thinking right now, for instance, a big working class part of our county is the southeast cities that are just to the southeast of downtown. They've never had a rail line, or they haven't for 50, 60 years. And so we're building one as part of Measure M, but that's pretty close to downtown. People who live west of downtown don't know many of those cities culturally, but the moment they discover it's a 10-minute rail ride, well, they displace all the working class, mostly Latino folks who live in our southeast cities, and suddenly they're pushed further out into places like what we call the Inland Empire, further east, et cetera. And if you don't have good housing policy, I think your public transportation and your transit work can fail. So we put in I think the boldest in the country, maybe somebody can raise their hand and beat it, but for a big city, we mandated 35% of all new housing built along these lines, because we're going to be assembling more land, our county transportation agency, than anybody ever has here. That 35% of that has to be low-income housing. That's a really big number. That's a tough number, and that meant that we're going to eat a lot of money we would have gotten selling that back to the marketplace, but it's absolutely the right thing to do. Second, in the city, at those big transit stops, we've dramatically upzoned in a ministerial way. I could have gone kind of low, medium, or high. I was given under a ballot measure that passed here the ability to just change that. So our transit-oriented communities program is what it's called. I said go the highest, and people can go even higher and denser if the lower income housing they subsidize. And in a single year, it's about 6,000 units that have been put forward, and 1,000 of them are low income. And of those, a third are extremely low income, which nobody builds, which keeps people from being homeless, for instance, which is my biggest focus in this city. For bus and rail, I think it's really important too. It's very sexy, and all of our rail lines continue to outperform what our projections are. While we have less of a decline here than in other parts of the country, we have a decline in our bus ridership. That's because buses are stuck in the same old traffic. We haven't thought about the place. So we put a lot of focus, and Mike Bonin, a council member who many of you, I think, will be meeting some on a walk today. Is that right, Salita? Or is that tomorrow morning? Is one of my appointees on our Metro board. And we started a committee on the rider experience. Because I think equity really starts with that. Is it a pleasant place to be? Is there something for your kid to do while you're waiting at the bus stop? Is there shade, like we've talked about, for folks when they're waiting in a hot city like LA? Can you plug in? Is it predictable? And then building out, these rapid transit lines means also the bus lines. So we've got 3 new bus rapid transit lines to build on our success of our Orange Line in the Valley, which is the most successful bus rapid transit in the country right now.
And infill, as you mentioned, in terms of the land use and transportation equation, infill in the heart of the city is one part of that equation. The other part of that equation is on the periphery and sprawl. And how do we, as full autonomy gets here, as we look forward to an era of autonomous vehicles, I think there's a sense that could promote a kind of land use that we're trying to get away from. In other words, if you can sleep or eat breakfast, drink coffee, read the paper on your long commute in from the Inland Empire, what kind of policy framework can we put in place to make sure that we're also paying attention to that side of the equation?
You know, it's interesting. Los Angeles is now, for metro area, census area, is the most densely populated city in America. It always surprises my friends from New York and other places. New York area is fifth, but LA is number one. And you fly over it and you're like, it doesn't look like it. Where are all the skyscrapers? And it's because we have, you know, what I call, instead of skyscrapers, yard scrapers, which is where, you know, 5 families are living where you think there's one, or, you know, there's more people packed into what you're looking at than you imagine. And so I think we already have a kind of a wall built around our metro area, not a lot of sprawl to go. So autonomy is really going to be about whether it's ordered autonomy or chaotic autonomy. An ordered autonomy does give a promise, I think, of folks being able to have, you know, kind of like one might live in Connecticut and go into New York City on a train. That's okay. People need their quiet time, their reading, their ability. When it's blended autonomy with folks who are still driving, it will be chaotic for a while, and the traffic will probably be worse, in my opinion, until we get to a point where the critical mass of autonomy allows the machines to do the thinking. And, you know, before I start sounding like a Terminator movie, when the machines, you know, start thinking together, you know, we all know how inefficient cars are today. 94% of the time, they're not moving. You know, even in peak traffic here in Los Angeles, which happens about 10% of the time, 90% of the road capacity is still available. And that's also another astounding statistic that people don't think through. So reordering that, you know, today an autonomous vehicle is going to be stuck in the same slow lanes, and public transit is 20 times more people per hour in that amount of space than even an autonomous vehicle, even if you pack some people in like sardines. So it isn't going to be in that till that point, probably more like 10 years from now, rather than the 5 years from now. And it'll be, you know, this next decade will be full of a lot of suffering as we change. We're building out our airport, and I tell people LAX is still going to be terrible to get in and out of for the next like 5 to 6 years. When it's done, it's going to be awesome. They're like, great, thanks, Mayor. But you know, you have to make those investments, and I think you have to take that jump. So for me, the autonomy will get there, but not overnight.
And to what extent is congestion pricing part of that mix? You mentioned New York, that certainly the obstacles there have been political ones between New York City and Albany. Yep. Here we may have political obstacles, but also some geographical ones, given the shape of the city, the fact that we don't have that single center. To what extent do you see that being part of the ultimate solution longer term?
I think it's a part of it, but LA is very confusing topography. There is a downtown, but we really aren't a central city and then the periphery where it gets less and less dense. It's like clusters of density. So it's a very complicated algorithm to figure out. I do think, though, I mean, my joke was I'm your average American. I have an Italian last name. I'm half Mexican, half Jewish. So here's my Jewish point. A Jewish holiday in Los Angeles, like there's no traffic. So I had 2 choices, either as the first elected Jewish mayor, declare more Jewish holidays in Los Angeles, which I'm not against and thinking about, but, or, you know, you realize we only need 10 or 15% of cars off the road and you get a lot more free flow in general. And so I don't know if it's congestion pricing, but back in the day when we had fuel rationing here and we had smoggy days, we used to do odd and even days on your license plate. So odd numbered license plates could go certain days and even ones on other days. I think it's time for us to start looking at things like that if people want to stay in their single passenger car. But it requires really state help to make that happen. And I can't mandate it as mayor of LA because we're one city of not just 88 cities, that's just the county of LA. People live in a 5-county region and there's no farmland or wilderness in between. So it is essentially an 18 million person city crossing about 150 jurisdictions. So I think we'll need some state help, but it wouldn't take a lot. And given the technology we have to match people with shared rides in a kind of private way, which, you know, we saw in the Bay Area happen a little bit, I think that's worth another take while we're going towards autonomy and rapid transit.
And I was really struck reading about the traffic patterns during the '84 Olympics, that actually we had about the same volume of traffic. It was just that it was spread out a bit more efficiently across the day, and that there were fewer people maybe commuting during rush hour, more people in the middle of the day, and people remember that as a moment of
It's the last time people remember
traffic.
like no traffic. I think that's half the reason people wanted me to get the Olympics was even if it's 10 years from now, 17 days with no traffic sounded attractive.
And it's already become very clear to me in my work in City Hall that deadline, that 10-year deadline, is a very effective sort of civic timeline to fix our attention, whether we're talking specifically about Olympic projects or not. So in terms of what the street and the sidewalk looks like, I'm curious for your thoughts about what that experience will be like for folks when they come back, particularly out of town visitors when they come back in 10 years, given how much is in flux.
You know, the Olympics are a really interesting thing because they're like magic dust for human beings. If I said that 10 years from now in your city, there's going to be something we're doing like a music festival for 17 days, let's work for 10 years to make our city really sparkle, people would say, great, that's your job, good luck. But you say the Olympics are coming, and it's like, I don't know, it's like meeting your future in-laws at your own home for the first time. You're like, oh, I better fix everything, hang up the art, it's going to look perfect, like we're going to get it done. And I think the same thing happens when it comes to urban planning. You know, our goal to end homelessness in this city, now that voters have passed 2 measures by 2028, because it's not an overnight thing you can solve, but inspiring people to do that. The 28 by 28 projects that I mentioned. But the street, and Salita's really helped lead a lot of this conversation, and with many partners that are in this room, and I think really for NACTO, this is the big question. What does the street look like, not just in LA 10 years from now, but in America? And the Olympics are a neat thing. When you go to an Olympics, I hadn't been to one since '84, but I went to the Rio one when we were chasing the Olympics. You see human beings start to change how they move. You see plazas and people coming together. You see new transit. You see point to point. I think you can see a street that isn't how we think of a street, which is stores or residences, sidewalk, and something where vehicles, and maybe occasionally some bikes move on. It becomes really a blended and integrated thing where, you know, maybe there's lanes that are just for autonomous vehicles and rideshare. Maybe we're having electric vehicles, which we're #1 in the country in now, mandated for every single autonomous rideshare company. And we'd love to join with other cities to do that together, so that if we all as cities say that to the Lyfts of the world, that if you want to bring autonomous shared vehicles in, they have to be zero emissions, that'll just drive the marketplace for the creation of those vehicles and the infrastructure for us to do that together. It becomes a much more blended street, and I do believe it will liberate tremendous amounts of open space in a city like Los Angeles, where downtown, 40% of downtown is built for cars to be parked and not move. That's not a really efficient use of space. It's very expensive to build housing because we still mandate all the parking requirements, when in a few years, who wants to own a car in downtown Los Angeles when you can get around using rideshare? So I think by the time the Olympics come here, you will see multimodal, but the street itself will be this kind of blended braid of transportation.
And I think in the TOC program you mentioned also the transit neighborhood planning that the planning department is doing along the major transit corridors. It's also important that we're talking about parking reform too. It's not just about density bonuses, it's also about getting rid of parking minimums. And the response from the market has been really significant.
No, a lot of people don't know this. In this car capital of the world, valet is dead in Los Angeles as a business. It's dead. I mean, we still mandate it in the city code. Valet folks are very difficult for them to make any money anymore. I mean, rideshare has basically killed off the valet, and why wouldn't it? I mean, do you really want to, if you're going out at night and you want to have a drink or two, or you want to just have the convenience, it's the same price as valet parking has been. So that's gone, and all of a sudden that, you know, changes how we have to think about the curb, think about planning, and think about even how we go out.
Just a couple more questions before we wrap up. You mentioned eVTOLs, and I'm really curious about how the so-called flying taxis and the colloquial will play out in a city like Los Angeles. Those of you who are from out of town may not know that one reason that a lot of these companies are looking at Los Angeles as a potential proving ground is that because we had a helipad requirement on our tall buildings, it's one reason we have a sort of flat top skyline. And actually this building that we're in now is the first building to have moved past that requirement, which we finally gotten rid of. But as a result of that requirement, we have this collection of helipads threaded through downtown Los Angeles, and a lot of those companies are seeing that as a potential place for takeoffs and landings. What's your sense about how soon that may be here, and whether the technology, or let's say the regulation, will be the obstacle in bringing it to
It's up to the FAA, but we've had pretty good discussions so far. We had a convening here with Uber Elevate, you know, I've delved into the technology pretty deeply. There's a lot of excitement around it. I think it will happen. I think the question is, will it be mass or will it be boutique? It'll be cheap enough to be mass, but do we have the capacity? For instance, if 4 rapid charging with technology today vertical takeoff and landing electric vehicles are charging at the same time, it's about the same voltage as the Empire State Building. So just the electric grid during the day, imagine if you had a few hundred of them and what the requirements are to make that happen. But we're fundamentally rethinking our electric grid for our EVs, for our port, because we want to plug in ships that are coming in, cargo ships. About 40% of the goods that come into all of your cities come through our port of LA. So it's a huge American port, but each one of those ships is the equivalent in pollution of about 50,000 cars, and they just kind of idle there. So the biggest source of pollution for us is that, but how do we get electricity so they can plug in? So we could potentially have that capacity for them. And you know, people are always like, oh my gosh, it's chaotic and it will be like accidents. Think about right now, we all deal, even though it's sometimes on topography like LA, a two-dimensional landscape that you have to manage. When it becomes three-dimensional, there is so much space up there. And again, when machines are doing the thinking, not us, it'll be much safer than walking on a street or driving. So I'm not worried so much about the safety issues. There might be the visual blight for some people, and there could be a little bit of the noise, even though they're quietish. They're not a helicopter. They're still kind of noisy once they come down to Earth. So there's a lot of companies, though, that are working on those. They're already testing them. They're on military bases as we speak. Right. And I'm ready to ride, so I'll volunteer.
Something Salita and I have talked about is the urban design implications are really significant. We've thought of the public right-of-way as being two-dimensional. It's really running along the streets and boulevards of the city, and now that will become a three-dimensional
and Salita's working with Google, right, on the what do you call the stack thing? The cube. So as Google has done all of its mapping, they're now looking at cubes about the size of, I don't know, maybe the size of this stage, a little bit smaller, in a cube, and managing maps now that way so that we can look at understanding cities both above and at that terrestrial level so that we can begin planning for transportation in 3 dimensions.
So final question for you. You
Yes.
talked about the fact that we're in the middle of this transportation revolution, and I think I want to focus on the fact that we're in the middle of it, and there's a sort of limbo period of transition that's going on, and I've certainly spent a long time thinking and writing about that transition in my old life. But I'm curious, in efforts like Vision Zero that are happening, not just in LA, but cities around the country, they have been difficult to achieve here because, from my point of view, we have trained drivers to expect a certain privileged way of getting around the city. We really shaped the city for many, many decades around the expectations of drivers. Yep. So do you see that pushback shifting? Do you see that kind of resistance going away over time as we sort of accelerate this transition to?
I think the conflict is overstated and over-amplified, which isn't to say we don't have some intense moments of conflict. But we've done, as I mentioned, over 1,200 Vision Zero improvements. Those are accelerating thanks to we're taking some of Measure M and our gas tax, which, knock on wood, hopefully will stay here in California because it's threatened with repeal in a ballot measure. But those two things together have given us resources that we've prioritized all of our infrastructure around our high-entry network and our Vision Zero. We just had the European Commissioner on Transportation here, Commissioner Boltz, this past week. And Europe, where it was born, she and I were talking about getting many more American cities. They don't have a single American city participating in a single day they do in September, where they try to have one day with no traffic deaths. And just the focusing that does on a single day, I think we've got to continue to get better and better. There are certain moments in which, talk radio and everybody's protesting and there's conflicts, but most revolutions happen quite quietly. And as long as I always say you have to be honest enough to say, okay, if I do 1,200 things, not all of them are going to work. Be able to be humble enough to roll certain ones back. But on balance, if you're doing 95% of the things that you set out to do, that's a pretty good batting average, and just keep doing them, putting up those bollards, figuring out the striping, re-engineering, doing enforcement. But I think to your point, the education is a really critical piece of this, because we are changing now as this becomes, our main focus in life, even beyond our relationships and our world around us, and the reality that people are driving and looking at devices, they're walking and looking at devices, and so you need to either enforce or educate people away from that. But I think there's a lot more still to do, and anybody who's not part of Vision Zero, join us on it. It is, I think people caricature that, oh my gosh, political leaders shouldn't do this. Here in LA, they're like, we announced that we were going to do Vision Zero and try to eliminate traffic deaths by 2025, and suddenly they're like, oh, it's not done yet, people are still dying. Well, we had a 7% reduction last year, double-digit reduction in pedestrians this year. those are real people that are still living. You can't quantify or point to who they are, but that is worth it. And a decade of that, if we cut it in half instead of by 100%, that was worth doing, because those are people who are going to be alive for decades from now because of those improvements. So, our reach must always exceed our grasp. That's what Vision Zero is: ending homelessness, trying to get rid of poverty, making people have a decent wage, building enough affordable housing for everybody. Do we always get there right away? Do we always get all the way there? Of course not. But once in a while, when you reach that far, you actually do grasp what you're going after. And in that poem where that comes from, a Robert Browning poem, our reach must exceed our grasp. After all, what is heaven for?
And to your point about Measure M, when we have taken these questions, I don't want us to jump on the applause, absolutely.
Let's hear it for Robert Browning, all right, yeah.
Poetry. But to your point about Measure M, and when we have taken these transportation and development land use questions to the voters, we've gotten a very clear message that is really resounding, despite some of the noise around the edges. So we could talk about this for many hours, but our time is up. So please join me in thanking the mayor.
Thank you, NACTO. Really appreciate it. Enjoy
Thanks,
LA.
everyone.
Thank you.
Terrific. Fun as always.
Yes, indeed.